if you shrunk the entire history of life on Earth into a single year, then the period when insects were absolutely massive nightmare fuel that dominated the skies lasted about 3 weeks. Which doesn't sound like much until you realize that in real time, that's roughly 60 million years of giant bugs being in charge. And I'm not talking about bugs that are just kind of big like a tarantula or something. I'm talking about dragonflies with wingspans wider than a hawk, millipedes longer than an alligator, and scorpions the size of golden retrievers. Basically, if you got sent back to the Carboniferous period around 300 million years ago, you'd think you accidentally stepped into a Monster Hunter game, but like the worst version where everything wants to eat you and also you can't respawn. And the craziest part? These weren't even considered apex predators of their time. They were just around, living their best lives, being absolutely massive. So the question is, how did insects get so absurdly big? And more importantly, why aren't they that big anymore? Well, buckle up because the answer is weirder than you think. Now, when most people hear giant insects, they immediately think of two things: cool sci-fi movie monsters and oxygen levels. And you'd be half right on that second one, but we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's talk about just how massive these things actually were, because the size difference is legitimately bonkers. The poster child for Carboniferous gigantism is definitely Meganeura, which is basically just a dragonfly that decided to become an absolute unit. This thing had a wingspan of up to 70 centimeters, or about 28 inches, which means it was wider than a modern peregrine falcon and about the same size as a large crow. To put that in perspective, the largest dragonfly alive today has a wingspan of only 19 centimeters or 7.5 inches, making Meganeura nearly 4 times bigger. And when something is 4 times bigger, it's not just a little bit scarier, it's exponentially more terrifying. But Meganeura wasn't even the weirdest one. That honor probably goes to Arthropleura, a millipede-like creature that measured up to 2.6 meters or 8.5 feet long and weighed an estimated 50 kilograms or 110 pounds. For reference, that's longer than most adult humans are tall and heavier than the average Great Dane. Imagine walking through a forest and having to step over what is essentially a millipede the length of a couch. Actually, don't imagine that because it's horrifying. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Surely something that big must have been a predator, right? Well, hold that thought because we'll come back to that. And the answer is going to make this creature even more bizarre. And then you had Pulmonoscorpius, a scorpion that reached lengths of 70 centimeters or 28 inches, basically the size of a medium dog. This thing had pincers strong enough to crush smaller arthropods, and presumably also your will to live if you happened to encounter one. Researchers believe it was likely venomous too, though exactly how toxic it was remains a mystery, which is somehow not reassuring at all. There were also massive cockroaches, spiders the size of your hand, and griffin flies, close relatives of dragonflies, that were even bigger than Meganeura in some cases. Basically, if it was an insect or arthropod and it lived during the Carboniferous, there was a decent chance it was nightmare-sized. Now, here's where people usually jump to conclusions. The common explanation you'll hear is, oh, there was more oxygen back then, so bugs got bigger. And while that's technically true, it's also way more complicated and weird than that simple explanation suggests. Because if it was just about oxygen, then we should see a perfect correlation between oxygen levels and bug size throughout Earth's history. But we don't. In fact, there are periods with high oxygen where bugs stayed small, and periods with lower oxygen where some bugs were still pretty big. So clearly something else is going on. So here's where things get weird. Yes, oxygen levels during the Carboniferous period were insane, peaking at about 35% of the atmosphere compared to today's 21%. But the reason this mattered wasn't just because more oxygen equals bigger bugs. The real reason is way more interesting and has to do with how insects breathe, which, spoiler alert, is absolutely terrible design. Unlike us, insects don't have lungs. Instead, they breathe through a network of tubes called tracheae that basically run throughout their entire bodies. Air enters through tiny holes called spiracles on their exoskeletons and then just diffuses through these tubes via passive diffusion. There's no active pumping, no circulatory system moving oxygen around, just vibes and diffusion gradients. It's like if your entire respiratory system was a bunch of straws duct taped together, except the straws don't actively suck, they just hope the air decides to wander down them. This system works fine when you're small, because diffusion is efficient over short distances. But as you get bigger, diffusion becomes increasingly terrible at delivering oxygen to your internal tissues. It's the same reason why you can't just breathe through a really long snorkel. Eventually, the air just doesn't make it all the way down. For modern insects, this creates a hard size limit of around 15 centimeters, or 6 inches for most species, because beyond that, their innermost tissues would basically suffocate. But 300 million years ago, with 35% oxygen in the atmosphere, diffusion suddenly became way more efficient. It's like if you upgraded from breathing through a coffee stirrer to breathing through a boba tea straw. Still not great, but significantly better. This allowed insects to grow much larger without their insides dying from oxygen deprivation. Some researchers estimate that the high oxygen levels could have allowed insects to grow up to 6 times larger than they could today, which tracks pretty well with what we see in the fossil record. However, and this is important, oxygen wasn't the only factor. If it was, then we'd expect insects to shrink immediately as oxygen levels dropped. But they didn't. In fact, some giant insects persisted well into the Permian period even as oxygen levels began to decline. So what gives? Well, it turns out that the other major factor was competition, or rather the lack of it. During the Carboniferous period, there were basically no flying vertebrates. Birds didn't exist yet. Bats were tens of millions of years away from evolving, and pterosaurs wouldn't show up until the Triassic period, about 60 million years later. This meant that insects had the skies entirely to themselves. There were no agile predators swooping in to eat them, no competitors fighting for the same aerial niches, just endless opportunity to get as big as they wanted. Meganeura, for instance, was likely the apex aerial predator of its time. It hunted other large insects, and possibly even early amphibians. Its massive eyes, containing over 30,000 individual lenses, gave it incredible vision for tracking prey, and its powerful flight muscles allowed it to reach speeds estimated at 43 kilometers per hour, or 27 miles per hour. Basically, it was a living attack helicopter that ran on vibes and high oxygen. And here's the kicker. Once you got that big and dominated the skies for millions of years, your descendants probably inherited some of those size-friendly genes, which is why even as oxygen levels dropped, some giant insects stuck around for a while. Evolution doesn't just hit the undo button immediately. Now you're probably thinking, okay, so high oxygen plus no competition equals giant bugs. I get it. But wait, because it gets weirder. And by weirder, I mean the entire ecosystem was basically designed to create these monsters. See, the Carboniferous period wasn't just notable for giant insects. It was also the age when forests first appeared. And not just any forests, but absolutely massive forests, dominated by scale trees and giant ferns that could reach heights of 30 meters or 100 feet. These weren't like modern trees either. They were basically giant club mosses with bark that looked like dragon scales, hence the name. And here's the thing. These trees were terrible at decomposing. Why? Because the fungi and bacteria that normally break down wood basically didn't exist yet, or at least not in any efficient form. Lignin, the tough woody substance that makes up tree bark, was a relatively new innovation in the plant world, and nature hadn't figured out how to recycle it yet. So when these trees died, they just stayed there for millions of years, piling up, creating absolutely massive amounts of organic matter that eventually turned into the coal deposits we mine today. In fact, the Carboniferous period is literally named after carbon because of all the coal it created. And all of this undecomposed plant matter did something incredible to the atmosphere. It locked away huge amounts of carbon dioxide while simultaneously pumping out oxygen through photosynthesis. It's estimated that during the peak of the Carboniferous, forests were producing oxygen at such an absurd rate that atmospheric levels skyrocketed to 35%, which again is way higher than today's 21%. But here's where it gets truly wild. With all that oxygen floating around, the entire world became a tinderbox. Forest fires during the Carboniferous weren't just common, they were apocalyptic. Some researchers believe that wildfires were so frequent and intense that entire regions would just periodically burst into flames. The high oxygen content meant that even wet wood could ignite, and once a fire started, it would burn hotter and faster than anything we see today. We're talking flames that could potentially reach temperatures of 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit. And somehow, the insects just dealt with it? Fossil evidence suggests that many giant arthropods had adaptations for surviving in fire-prone environments, including thick exoskeletons and the ability to burrow underground or hide in water. Arthropleura, that nightmare millipede I mentioned earlier, likely spent a lot of time in moist, swampy areas where it was safer from fires. Meanwhile, Meganeura probably had the advantage of being able to just fly away from danger, though, given how often fires occurred, it must have been like living in a constant state of the floor's lava, except the floor is actually lava. There's also evidence that some insects may have actually benefited from the fires. Burns would clear out old vegetation and create new habitats, and the ash would fertilize the soil, leading to rapid regrowth that could support even more insect life. It's like the entire ecosystem was running on a cycle of burn everything, regrow everything, repeat. And the insects were just vibing through it. Oh, and speaking of vibing, let's talk about Arthropleura's diet for a second, because it's genuinely baffling. Despite being the size of a couch and having mandibles strong enough to potentially crush bone, evidence suggests that Arthropleura was likely herbivorous. That's right, this absolute unit of a millipede was out here just munching on plants and minding its own business. Some researchers even think it may have eaten decaying plant matter, making it basically a giant composting machine with legs. Though there is some debate about whether it occasionally snacked on smaller animals, the consensus is that it was mostly peaceful. Which honestly makes it even more terrifying, because imagine being chased by something the size of an alligator, and then finding out it just wanted to eat your garden. So obviously this whole giant insects ruling the earth thing didn't last forever. Starting around 250 million years ago during the Permian period, atmospheric oxygen levels began to drop, and more importantly, flying vertebrates finally showed up to the party. Pterosaurs appeared in the Triassic, birds evolved in the Jurassic, and eventually bats joined in during the Paleogene. Suddenly, insects had competition in the skies, and that competition was really good at eating them. See, vertebrates have a massive advantage over insects when it comes to flight. They're way more agile. Birds and bats can perform complex aerial maneuvers that insects simply can't match at larger sizes. An insect the size of Meganeura would have been relatively slow and clumsy compared to, say, a hawk. This meant that once vertebrates evolved flight, they quickly outcompeted giant insects for aerial niches and also started actively hunting them. It's basically like if you were the only person who knew how to drive for 60 million years, and then suddenly everyone else learned, and they're all better at it than you. Not great for the insects. On top of this, the drop in oxygen levels meant that insects could no longer sustain their massive sizes as easily. Remember, their respiratory system is terrible, and without that 35% oxygen boost, maintaining a large body became increasingly difficult. Over millions of years, natural selection favored smaller, more efficient body sizes that could still get enough oxygen with the new, lower atmospheric levels. But here's the thing, insects didn't just give up and go extinct. Instead, they diversified like crazy. Today, insects are the most successful group of animals on Earth in terms of sheer diversity, with over 1 million described species, and potentially millions more yet to be discovered. They adapted to every conceivable environment, from deserts to rainforests to freshwater lakes, and developed an incredible array of survival strategies. So in a way, insects didn't lose. They just changed the game. This actually means something pretty profound for how we think about evolution and success. We tend to assume that bigger is better, that dominating your environment through sheer size is the ultimate goal. But the story of Carboniferous insects shows that's not always true. Those giant dragonflies and millipedes ruled for 60 million years, which is impressive, but modern insects have been thriving for over 400 million years by being adaptable rather than dominant. They survived the Permian Triassic extinction that wiped out 96% of all species. They survived the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. They've survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and now they're even adapting to human-altered environments. Try finding a cockroach that can't survive basically anything we throw at it. And if you're wondering whether giant insects could ever come back, the answer is technically yes, but extremely unlikely. If atmospheric oxygen levels somehow spiked back up to 35% and all flying vertebrates went extinct, then sure, insects could potentially grow large again over millions of years. But given that we're currently pumping CO2 into the atmosphere at record rates, and oxygen levels are actually slightly declining, I wouldn't hold your breath. Or actually, do hold your breath, because that might help with the oxygen thing. I'm not a scientist. So to recap, 300 million years ago, insects were absolutely massive because the Earth's atmosphere was basically an oxygen bar on steroids. Forests couldn't decompose, so they just kept making more oxygen. Everything was constantly on fire, and there were no flying vertebrates around to eat the giant bugs or compete with them. It was basically the perfect storm of conditions that allowed dragonflies the size of hawks and millipedes the length of alligators to just exist and do their thing. And the wildest part? These creatures weren't even trying to be monsters. Arthropleura was just out here eating plants and minding its own business. Meganeura was just trying to catch some flies, albeit really big flies. They were just normal animals living in an abnormal world, and the fact that we look at them as terrifying nightmare fuel says more about us than it does about them. So the next time you see a regular-sized dragonfly or millipede, maybe show it some respect. Its ancestors were literally gods among insects, ruling the skies and forests for millions of years. And honestly, given that modern insects are still thriving despite being tiny, maybe they figured out that being big isn't everything. Or maybe they're just biding their time, waiting for oxygen levels to spike again so they can reclaim their throne. Either way, I'm keeping an eye on them. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Extinct Zoo.